There's a simple reason why I think a lot of people choose not to engage with politics. It comes down to an idea or a feeling that it's impossible to actually make any meaningful change, and that trying to do so through politics will do more to actually drive a wedge between people than it will to help matters. And I personally really understand that frustration. I mean, it's super easy to feel cynical about a political system that is failing a lot of people in a lot of different ways. But at the same time, I feel like that perspective doesn't tell the whole story. Because when you take a closer look, the political world is full of people who are hopeful and optimistic that they can actually make things better, despite all the obstacles. And there's something really inspiring and amazing about that. One of the ways that some activists are trying to improve our politics are through alternative voting methods. So instead of being forced to choose between just two candidates, red versus blue, voting systems like ranked choice voting or approval voting or star voting would give people the freedom to vote for more fringe candidates or for third-party candidates without being accused of throwing away their vote. This would make room for a greater diversity of opinions within our political discourse and might make it so more people feel like they're being properly represented. I personally became interested in ranked choice voting after I was volunteering for the Andrew Yang presidential campaign back in 2019-2020. At that time, Yang's campaign was really centered around his forefront idea of universal basic income, which is another policy I'm really passionate about. I'm definitely going to talk about UBI and my time with the Yang gang more on this channel. But for today, I want to focus in on ranked choice voting, which also became one of the favorite policy proposals of Yang supporters. And in fact, when the presidential campaign ended, Andrew Yang himself made ranked choice voting his top priority, going so far as to start an entirely new political party called the Forward Party, focused on tearing down the two-party dichotomy via ranked choice voting and open primaries.
Change the process, make it so that politicians have to appeal to a majority of us and new points of view can emerge.
So this is something that is a really buzzing topic within that community. And recently, this idea has really started to catch on. We've seen a number of jurisdictions implement ranked choice voting recently. New York City actually just had their first ranked choice election, and organizations such as FairVote have been spearheading the movement towards an improved democracy. So when I came across a flyer that was promoting the idea of approval voting in my own neighborhood, it caught my interest. I decided to reach out to the group, and they put me in touch with one of their head organizers and today's guest, Logan Bowers. Logan is the owner of Seattle-based business #Cannabis, and he was a former candidate for Seattle City Council back in 2019.
Our city faces tough problems, but I am a problem solver, and I have a plan.
And although he didn't win that election, Logan continues to have a passion for improving local Seattle politics. Recently, that passion has manifested itself through his advocacy of approval voting. I thought it would be interesting to talk to Logan about voter reform and the differences between these alternative voting systems. So I reached out and invited Logan to sit down and have a conversation with me about it. And he agreed. But as it turns out, just a day or two before he came to record our podcast, an article came out in our local paper, The Stranger, where members of the organization FairVote came out publicly against approval voting in Seattle. I found this really surprising because FairVote had kind of been the leading advocates for ranked choice voting, and I thought that they'd also support approval voting as a better alternative to what we have, but apparently that wasn't how they saw it. So when Logan came to talk to me a few days later, I thought I'd give him the opportunity to respond to that article, and then we'd dig into the nuances of the different voting systems. So here's that conversation. Enjoy. We're officially rolling. We're going to get started real casual. Thank you so much for joining me here.
Oh, my pleasure, Zach. Thanks for having me.
For the audience here, I'm sitting here with Logan Bowers, who is the co-founder of #Cannabis and also an advocate for approval voting here in Seattle. So I kind of came across your project, the Approval Voting Project, through one of your posters that's up here in Capel.
Nice.
I just was walking down the street, I bumped into it, and I'm someone who's taken an interest in ranked choice voting, particularly because I was a volunteer with the Andrew Yang presidential campaign.
Yep.
Are you kind of familiar with all of that?
Yeah.
Cool. And have you read his new book? Are you familiar with kind of his new approach to pushing ranked choice voting, his third party?
I mean, I've seen that he's working on a third party. I'm glad that someone at the national level is working on voting reform of like some kind. Anything is better than what we have today. So, so there's tons of room for improvement. Nowhere to go but up.
So yeah, basically I saw that and I was just thought it'd be cool to have have a conversation about the differences in these approaches. I'm just going to lay it out for the people who are watching this who aren't familiar with ranked choice voting first. Ranked choice voting is instead of when you're just selecting the one candidate from the list and voting for them, you get to, as the name implies, rank the candidates in order from your favorite to least favorite. And if your most favorite candidate doesn't hit a certain threshold, then your vote goes to your next favorite candidate.
Yep.
So would you walk me through what approval voting is?
Yeah. So approval voting is similarly, it's a very simple reform. And basically right now on your ballot in like a Seattle primary election, you might have 15 candidates and it says pick one. Approval voting is a change to pick as many as you want. So if you like 2 candidates, you can pick 2. If you like 5, you can pick 5. If you like 14, you can pick 14. You can pick as many or as few as you want. And then the candidate with the most votes, i.e. the highest approval, or the 2 candidates actually, since it's a primary, advance to the general.
Okay. And so how did you get to the point, I guess, where you are kind of leading this coalition, trying to build and organize a path towards approval voting? How did you get here? What's your background?
Yeah, so, I've worked in software engineering for about 20 years. At one point, myself and some other folks had a startup that we built and eventually sold to Amazon. I worked there for a while. Then later, my wife and I started Hashtag Cannabis, which is a cannabis retailer here in town when the system legalized. So we have a shop in Fremont and then also in Redmond. And so I've always been a fan of voting reform, or at least for a very long time. I remember supporting the failed 2005 ranked choice initiative in Seattle, which is eons ago. And then in 2019, I ran for Seattle City Council here in District 3. Did not win, but that's okay. I did get the opportunity to door knock and talk to probably about 5,000 of our neighbors here in District 3. And that gave me a really great perspective on how voters think, how what they care about, how they treat primary elections. And so coming off of the 2019 election cycle, a longtime friend of mine, Troy, who's co-chairing Seattle Approves with me, introduced me to approval voting. And when I saw that, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so much better. It so well matches the kind of thought processes of the voters. And I think it's simple enough that voters can use it and apply it, and it'll get used properly. So when I saw that, it clicked that like, oh, this is definitely the way to go. So then Troy and I co-founded Seattle Approves, and we've been working our way towards a ballot measure, and we think we're going to have a voting reform ballot measure here in Seattle in 2022.
Wow. So what's that process been like? Actually getting it onto the ballot, like taking the steps. I mean, you have an idea. How do you bring it into actuality? What's that process like?
Yeah. So the first step for us was finding folks who think similarly and want to see this done. And so for us, that was finding the national organization Center for Election Science. So they're a voting reform nonprofit that looks for ways to improve our election systems. And they've supported us through a grant for it to form a local chapter here in Seattle, and that's Seattle Approves. So we got involved. We saw work that had been done to adopt approval voting in Fargo and St. Louis, and we're like, awesome, we'd love to do that here. We applied for a grant from Center for Election Science. They granted us some money in 21, and now we decided, hey, we're going to pull the trigger and do the work to get to ballot in 22. So that's going to be a lot of outreach, postering, cold calls, warm calls, door knocking, you name it, emails galore. And it's going to be a lot of fundraising, but we'll get it done. So I'm excited.
Well, one of the things that I'm curious about is why you chose, I guess, to put your energy towards approval voting rather than ranked choice voting. It's like you said, I think either one would be much better than what we have right now. But like in the Stranger article that came out recently, there were several people from the organization FairVote, which is pushing for ranked choice voting, who seem to be kind of set on like we need to focus on one of these or the other. And obviously their eggs are in the ranked choice basket, so they were saying like let's keep focused on ranked choice. I'm curious what makes you lean more towards approval voting.
Yeah. Yeah, like most folks, I started out supporting ranked choice because, I'd never heard of anything else other than our current voting system. And I was like, wow, this is better. Sounds great. And it wasn't for quite a while until I discovered there's other systems. And when I came across approval voting, which has been around a long time, and there's plenty of literature on it, it was just new to me, it really clicked for me that it has a really good balance of incredibly high performance and incredible simplicity. So I'll unpack both of those. So first, for performance. So you can score different voting systems on how well they select candidates that match the intent of the voters. And that's fundamentally, that's the problem we have, is the system we have doesn't do that as well as it could. So there's various measures for this. The one I like is voter satisfaction efficiency. So you can look this up. There's some academic literature if you Google that. And voter satisfaction efficiency scores voting systems on a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 is basically you can think of as like pick candidate at random, and 100 is like read everyone's mind and pick the candidate that like best matches a majority. Yeah. And our current voting system, plurality voting, is like 75-ish. Ranked choice is like low 80s, and approval voting is like 90. So, and then there's a few esoteric systems like star voting, which score even better.
I did want to get into that.
Yeah, we can talk about that in a little bit. So right out of the gate, like approval voting is awesome simply because it does a really good job of picking winners that match the voter intent. And then, but the thing that really drove it home for me is when I was canvassing and talking to neighbors and voters, what I realized is like a lot of voters don't spend a whole lot of time voting. They'll maybe spend 10 minutes on their ballot. You'll be lucky if they can remember the name of the person they selected. So what that means is, and there's a lot of, very good reasons for that. Yeah, I mean, you and I, I'm sure are relative voting nerds or political junkies. But most people are living their lives, spending time with their family, or maybe they don't make a ton of money and they're working 2 jobs, or maybe English is not their first language, so handling a ballot is actually very difficult. So folks are not going to spend a lot of time on their ballot, and so it's really important to make it simple. And the cognitive burden of, if you're in a race with 15 candidates, of trying to stack rank 15 is very high. I mean, it's like, oh my God, is this person 5th or 7th, right? Oh, I mean, 2, even when you're coming like, well, I like these top 3, but like, what order do I put them in? And all of that's like enormously consequential in ranked voting. But for the voter, it's a lot of work. So, it's conceptually, I think it's very easy for a voter to kind of go down the list and just look at each candidate in isolation and be like, is this my guy or is this not my guy or gal? They can make that trade-off pretty easily, and I think voters have a very strong sense with various voters.
At this point in our conversation, we had a brief interruption from some outside noise. I'm going to cut that out and just continue you where we pick back up on this conversation.
I think it's very easy for a voter to kind of go down the list, look at the voter pamphlet, look at the literature, maybe if they've talked to the candidates, be like, yeah, I like this person, I don't like this person, I like this person, I don't like that person. And so that's like just a very natural choice for them. So it makes it easy. It means that the voters will stay engaged.
So one of the downside that I see about like the approval technique is that if there is one candidate that like is above all the rest, like here in Seattle, for example, if there was one candidate out of the whole bunch that was offering a basic income pilot, like that's a particular policy that's important to me, that person would be at the top of the list for me. And then there might be a couple of progressive candidates who I would also like be happy with, but I'd still like what I like about ranked choice voting is I have a way to indicate that like this is I think better than that. Um, I wonder if like with approval voting, if I would end up like just not only voting for that one person instead of actually voting for all the people I approve of because I want to be able to indicate that. Do you think that that's something that could come up or like an issue in terms of that?
Um, I don't think there's a risk of that. I think both systems will indicate that as you describe. And in fact, I think approval voting will describe a little bit more. So we had a great example in the 2021 mayoral race here in Seattle, where Andrew Grant Houston ran as a more or less single issue candidate on housing, and he got a very tiny vote share. And I think it's not surprising because he didn't really have a shot at winning. He just wasn't viable enough with enough voters. But housing, for me, it's very important. It's my top issue. But like, I did not vote for him because I knew it would be throwing away my vote. In an approval voting system, I absolutely would then have the ability to say, oh yeah, okay, well, housing is my top issue and he's the best on housing, so I'll fill that bubble. Everyone else in the race will see what share of the electorate really cared about that issue. So if it's UBI for you, either ranked choice or approval will will show the true support for a UBI policy among the electorate. And it might be your top choice, but it actually might be important to other people, even if it's not their top. Housing is my top policy, but I like UBI, so I would also check the box for the UBI candidate. And so then you in approval voting, you actually kind of communicate that. You can communicate that on multiple topics, right? I could pick the housing single issue person and the UBI single issue person, and that would all aggregate up into the results.
Have you reached out to anyone from FairVote or any of these ranked choice voting organizations and tried to kind of create like a part? I was kind of surprised to see that article with so much resistance from the ranked choice crowd because like from where I'm sitting, it's like we're all just trying to make the system work a little better. So I'm kind of surprised by it and personal communication with them.
Yeah, honestly, I'm pretty surprised too. No, we reached out when we started looking into approval voting in Seattle. We reached out to FairVote. It was one of the first people on our list. I've talked to Lisa over a year ago. She's the executive director, and we were completely transparent about what we're working on, where we're going. We want to see if we wanted to work together. There's always legislation in Olympia, so getting more people behind that is for just voting reform of any kind is always good. It's unfortunate they came out swinging, but we're excited to have a system that an option for Seattle voters that works better and will work after 2022. So it'll be available in 2023, which I think approval voting is the only one that will hit all three of those criteria.
So why do you think that is? I know that there was a recent push for ranked choice voting that got postponed just recently. Do you know anything about that? And because I see that kind of as like what seems to be is the most current push. Before I saw your flyer, like in terms of like our local legislators, that effort, which was led by Council Member Gimray.
Girmay Zahalai is, I believe, the correct pronunciation.
That's a tricky one.
It is.
But yeah, he seemed to be one of the leaders in terms of that, and he ended up postponing it and saying they wanted to work out the details a little bit. But it still seemed like that was kind of like the most active current effort. Do you not see that to be the case, or do you think that that's not going to happen within the time?
Yeah, there's a couple of challenges. We're grateful to Councilmember Zahalai for, again, picking up the mantle on voting reform. Anything to move the ball forward is always good. And we, of course, reached out to him at the same time and said, hey, we're working on approval voting. We'd love to have flexibility in the way the language is drafted so that, cities can choose, et cetera, et cetera. Broadly, move the goal forwards for everyone who, for all the systems that are kind of on the table at the moment. I think the reason that stalled out, hopefully not for too long, is a lot of folks on the council were rightfully unsure of what they were voting on. So that went from proposal to vote in 3 weeks. I think that's probably pretty fast turnaround for like revamping a whole election system for a whole region. I think they'll get there. I think probably just take a little more time to get all of the council on board. But yeah.
So do you see that as like an opposing, like if they're trying to push that and you already have some local legislators who are trying to push for ranked choice voting, that do you see that as like something you have to compete with in terms of your push for approval voting, or do you see these as movements that can work in together?
Yeah. Oh, they definitely can. I mean, I think it's really clear, important to understand that the county legislation would have only affected county elections. So, county executive and King County Council. It wouldn't have affected any of the elections at the municipalities within King County, of which there's like a great many more races. So, obviously the county can pick one thing and Seattle can pick a different thing. I think the big issue here is like Seattle has a very acute need for voting reform because we uniquely have a democracy voucher program. So for any of your viewers who are not familiar, democracy vouchers, every voter in Seattle at election time for city offices gets $100 from the city in voucher form to donate to a candidate of their choice, and the city cuts a check on the voter's behalf. So our elections are publicly funded for the most part. Now, what that means is that there's a lot of contributions to many candidates, and so consequently the races are huge. We had 15 for mayor. In the 2019 cycle, we had 13, believe, in District 6 and 12 in District 4 candidates. So like lots and lots of candidates. So we really need a reform because when there's that many candidates, there's vote splitting. There's all sorts of problems that are made worse by plurality voting, the system we have today. So we need it in Seattle way more than like the county needs it in the county races where there's maybe 3 candidates, where voting reform just doesn't change the outcomes that much.
So is there a way that the different voting like methods would work like with each other in terms of like if locally in Seattle we decided to say do approval voting, but then like the state of Washington passed something for like ranked choice voting, how would those two things match? Do you know, or is it kind of a we have to choose our path kind of thing?
Yeah, no, I mean
that seems like that would be very confusing for voters if like their local election had one method of voting and then
yeah,
they had a whole different one.
Yeah, I mean, I think so you could do it, right? Because every race is different, and the races at the state level could have one system, and the races at the state level could have a different system. There's some mitigating factors. Like city races are in odd years, state races are in even years. So if you had different systems, you could do that. I do think realistically, we're not actually close to having any sort of system. So we could choose to harmonize that later. If the state as a whole chooses to go one direction or the other, we could then harmonize that in the city by altering the city system or vice versa. I think that's all a great conversation to have. But it's going to take almost until the end of the decade at the very, very earliest before we would see any change in the voting system at the state level, unlikely until the 2030s. So, I think the opportunity to have voting reform now in Seattle, demonstrate a system that works and works better than anything else on the table, including ranked choice, and let the state see how well that goes for a couple of years while we decide what we ultimately want to do at the state level. I think is great learning experience for the whole state. And then I think they can decide, maybe we switch it up or maybe we don't.
So I'd love to I'm going to jump around to a few different things.
Sure.
But first, I'm curious to get your take on the democracy dollars. I know that they are somewhat like a new kind of thing here in the city, but they've been around for a couple election cycles. It seems like the candidates are getting more in the swing of kind of collecting them and that sort of stuff. One of the things that I heard was that Andrew Grant Houston, who you mentioned earlier, despite, like you said, being kind of a long shot candidate, he got more of the democracy vouchers than any other candidate. Why do you think that didn't help him make him more of a viable candidate? Or because it seems like if that's where all the funding's coming from, how come he still had that appearance, like you were saying, of maybe being like a less likely candidate.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a really good story for democracy, which is like money does not buy votes. Doesn't, just getting money does not guarantee a win, is I think what that shows. And I think that's a good thing. So we should all be pretty pleased that the system is working as intended here, and that outsider candidates can raise money and run viable campaigns, but ultimately the voters are clearly just making choices. Now, that said, I do think there's the challenge, right? Which is like when you have an outsider candidate and you have like a mainstream candidate, as a voter, you're going to be like, well, I feel like I'm going to throw my vote away on this outside candidate, even though I like them more. So that is one of the most driving valuable qualities of approval voting, which is that you can now pick both.
So this kind of brings me around to another related topic that kind of goes hand in hand, at least with the way Andrew Yang talked about ranked choice voting in particular. He really pushes it to go along with open primaries. And he talks about how then you could have, third-party candidates and people who don't necessarily fit in with one party or the other still have more of a viable chance. How do you feel about open primaries? It seems like the approval voting that you're talking about is focused on the primary.
Yes. Yeah. So two pieces of that. So just real quick, one of the big reasons that we're focusing with Seattle Approves on the primary is, one, that's where all the candidates are. But more importantly, Washington state law requires a primary with a top two general. So we, by state law, are required to have a primary where two winners advance to a general election. So we can't change that structure. So we can use approval voting in the primary. But
why can't we change that? Like, if we wanted to, isn't that something that we could also push to change? And do you think that is or isn't something that should be changed?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, like, in theory, anything can be changed because laws can be changed. It's just like 20x harder.
Yeah.
Because what you see is like legislators really don't like to change the system of voting that got them elected. So at most you get out of Washington, out of the Washington state legislature or another state's legislature is authorization to make the change. And then you still have to go run a citizen initiative to do it. Very, very rarely do elected officials volunteer to change the system that they win in, and maybe and risk losing. So at the so in order to change the primary, we would have to almost certainly run an initiative statewide, which is incredibly difficult, takes millions of dollars. We can solve 95% of the problem that we have in Seattle, but simply by reforming the voting system within the primaries, within the primary system.
Okay, so if we had approval voting in place for this most recent primary, what do you think would have changed?
Yeah, so it's always hard to speculate on a counterfactual, and I think just because one of the great things about approval voting is candidates will change their behavior, right? They'll recognize that they need to be popular with many voters, so they will work really hard to pull as many voters as possible into their coalition by pulling people's important issues and putting together a big coalition. So for your example of UBI, any forward-thinking Seattle candidate who wants to pull in the UBI crowd, of which is probably actually quite a few given Andrew Yang's performance, they're going to be like, how can I bring that into my platform so that those voters approve of me? And that suddenly becomes very important. So in this so that will change the playing field a little bit. But given that, in this last race, I think we have two really good examples in the city attorney race and in the mayoral race. So in the city attorney race, we had Pete Holmes, who was a 4-term incumbent, and which was probably on the political spectrum like fairly left. And then we had a much further left challenger, Nicole Thomas Kennedy. And then we had a Republican challenger, Ann Davison, where Seattle's like 90. I think it went for Joe Biden by like 85%. So Republicans are not very common in Seattle, and they all got about the same. They all got in the low 30s for vote share in the primary, but Pete Holmes was the lowest at about 30%, and he was eliminated. So we ended up with this race between two extremes, and I think a lot of voters were pretty unhappy with that. And I think on either side of that, regardless of where your preferences lie, that wasn't an ideal outcome. if you're a Nicole Thomas Kennedy supporter, seeing the race go to a Republican, which Seattle hasn't elected in over 30 years, is a pretty bad outcome. You probably would have been happier settling for Holmes. And if you're a Davison supporter, seeing Nicole Thomas Kennedy lose by only 4 points is kind of your worst nightmare. And then there's a huge swath of voters in the middle who are probably pretty unhappy with either. So that's a race where approval voting almost certainly would have set up a Pete Holmes versus either Nicole Thomas Kennedy or Ann Davison, depending on how much crossover vote there was. And then we would have had a real election with, I think, at least more compelling choices versus hold your nose and vote for the lesser of two evils election.
Do you think that runs the risk then of, like, I guess, appealing to, like, the most common denominator, sort of, watering down, like finding, like, the candidate who would end up being most popular being the one who, I guess, pleases everyone a little bit, but nobody completely, Is there, like, a run of risk of that? And especially for, like, like, marginalized communities, whether it's the homeless or, like, people of color who, like, don't get their voices heard as loud and are more likely to have their voices erased from the conversation. Do you think that would run the risk of then having those voices continue to be pushed out, just because, like, the most popular, the cheese pizza, as the stranger put it, the cheese pizza version of a candidate gets elected? It's hard to make actual progress. Do you think that's a real concern?
No, on the contrary, I think the opposite is true. So let me unpack that. So the common criticism we get is approval voting. If you're picking pizza for lunch in a group, we'll select cheese pizza because most people will want meat, but then the vegetarians, don't eat meat. So you'll end up compromising on cheese or maybe an inoffensive veggie pizza. And so the ranked choice position, curiously, is like, yeah, let the vegetarians starve because they're a minority group, which makes no sense. I mean, like, what? So the approval voting system absolutely picks something that, yes, the vegetarians can eat and yes, the meat eaters can eat. I think the approval voting would select mushroom pizza because mushroom has a nice umami flavor to it. But it would be palatable to everyone. So then at least no one starves. And what this really shows is this really draws a clear line, I think, which is in this cheese pizza criticism or analogy, the vegetarians represent a minority of the population, and both plurality voting and ranked choice voting shuts them out, and they get no pizza. In an approval voting system, their voice really matters because if there's two candidates, that are vying for the position, and one of them is like meat all the way, but one of them's like, well, no, I'll pick something that everyone can eat. They'll get a few more people on their coalition and they'll edge out that other similar challenger. So I think it makes these smaller groups actually more influential because every last vote matters. No one can be taken for granted and no one can be ignored. Because when there are two similar candidates racing, like anyone who can squeeze out a couple percentage point advantage will be the winner in an approval voting system.
So I guess then I'd like to double back a bit and compare. We've been talking so much about ranked choice voting versus approval voting, but I'd love to also get your take on star voting because it kind of seems like it might be the best of both worlds in that, with star voting, you get to vote for as many candidates as you want to, but you get to rate them from 1 to 5, and the more you like them, the more points you get, and it's the most total points for that candidate ends up, finding your nominee. How do you think that compares? Is there a reason why you don't think star voting is? I mean, earlier you said that it had an even higher percentage of, like, voter satisfaction. So I'm curious why approval over star then.
Yep. Yeah. So you can think of star as approval voting as like degenerate star, right? If star voting is a scale of 1 to 5, approval voting is a scale of 0 or 1. So it's like a star scale with fewer stars. Yeah. So the challenge with star is, like, from an intellectual point of view, it's amazing, and you're like, this is great. From a practical standpoint, it's very challenging, and I mean, it boils down, I think, on two levels. The first being going back to cognitive burden on the voter. Star voting puts a higher cognitive burden on the voter. And I think it's still in the same kind of sphere as approval voting. But anytime you get to a mail-in ballot with a giant grid of bubbles where you're going to lose some voters and they're going to get overwhelmed. So, from that perspective, it's not as good as approval voting in terms of cognitive burden on the voter. The other big issue is try explaining how tabulation works for star voting to someone, and I mean you're going to have a half-hour conversation at minimum. I mean, like the tabulation's complicated, and you can't, as a lay voter, you can't just look at the totals and be like, well, I understood what went on there, right? It's like, oh, okay, you got to compare the star values, and then they go advance to a runoff, and then in the runoff, the behavior is different. And so I think in the current era where election systems are being questioned left and right, and democracy integrity is being questioned, I think having a tabulation that is very, very simple and very transparent and very straightforward is a huge asset. And approval voting is of all the systems that we're talked about so far, is the only one that's like plurality voting, composable. So you can break it down by precinct, or you can break it down by sub-geographic area and look at the totals in every little spot. And so that's really good, right? If you're trying to track down, like, well, are the voting patterns realistic? Do we think somebody cheated? Being able to break the vote down by location is actually like pretty amazing.
Yeah. Cool. Well, this has been really awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time. I guess one other question that I have is, for me, I kind of came upon ranked choice voting and now approval voting, democracy reform, as basically a reaction to feeling like other policies like UBI or Medicare for All or whatever it be, there's like a brick wall, between like being able to actually get the idea and make it happen, and it seems like the way our democracy is currently operating is that brick wall, and so that's where democracy reform comes in. That's why it's become such an important thing for me. I was curious, do you have an equivalent thing of, like, for me it's UBI, of like, if we had approval voting in place that would set the ground to be able to do X, Y, and Z? What are the other things that you think that Seattle in general could do if they had this?
Yeah. Oh, great question. Love that one. Broadly, I think one of the best things about Seattle is a lot of really great policies are also really popular. So things for me like Seattle Subway ran a poll and found mid 70 percentage point support for higher taxes to build more mass transit in the city. Or Seattle Neighborhood Greenways ran a poll and found anywhere from 60 to 80% support for improving walkability and bikeability and road safety in the city. So if you have a system that only elects candidates that take popular positions, like in Seattle, that's actually pretty great. Like, a lot of the popular positions are fantastic. For me, it's housing. So I want to see Seattle have enough housing so that we can all afford to live here. There's lots of people who get squeezed out because they can't afford the rent. Somebody else is living in that home that outbid them. We need another home so that the person who got outbid can still be here too, and so on and so forth. And so that's a city-controlled policy, how much housing gets built by the zoning code, and I would love to see that get more so that our kids and grandkids can live here. If we're living here and young but want to start a family, we can find somewhere to live in, still in city limits, and raise a family. So that's what's exciting for me.
And you think that the current voting system is one of the big impediments between us and actually achieving that goal?
Absolutely. I think any time that, as I said, good policy is actually usually pretty popular in Seattle. And anytime that gets watered away by special interest groups or small factions, we get worse outcomes. So,
well, that's kind of a bonus question, I guess. But Seattle is a very progressive place. It is very popular for a lot of these kind of progressive policies here. Do you think approval voting would be as successful in a place unlike Seattle, where maybe the voters are a little less agreeable with one another?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you consider success. I mean, in a democracy, I consider success following the will of the voters, and sometimes we have to accept that the voters want things that maybe aren't great, or at least not great by our own personal standards. So, like, yes, I do think approval voting would work in, say, a very red district. It would, enable them to enact very red policies that are popular with their voters. Which maybe wouldn't be my taste, but it would be democratic.
Do you think overall then that if the blue states got bluer and the red states got redder, do you think that that would like lead us to more kind of, division in terms of that political?
Um, I don't think so. I think fundamentally, I mean, at that point, it's an argument of whether or not democracy is good. And I believe that more democracy equal more gooder. So
I think this is like one of the things that like ranked choice, like an open primaries, the combination of them kind of tries to tackle. And I guess I'm trying to get at whether approval voting would accomplish the same thing. It is like that ability to kind of defuse the choose one or the other, and that comes with the open primaries as well. Do you think that that's something that,
yeah,
in the broader picture of things, like would work with approval voting in a similar way? If it was more popularized in more areas.
yeah. Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. Well, certainly, Seattle already has open primaries, so so we're fortunate there. If we didn't, that would be part of the reform package we'd be pushing. That's a clear no-brainer. I do think, I think approval voting is complementary to all of those other voting reforms, like eliminating primaries or open primaries or even year election, moving municipals to even year elections. All of those things, like approval voting, is complementary to all of those. We can then do those at a later date.
Cool. Well, I think you really touched on most of my questions here. I guess the only thing I'd like to end on is like, what can the ordinary people who happen to watch this, what can they do to help?
Yeah, thanks. So if you want to help out and get Seattle approves, get approval voting on the ballot, then go to seattleapproves.org. You can sign up for our mailing list. You can click the donate button and contribute financially. We're always very appreciative of that if you can spare the money. So thank you in advance. And we'll have various volunteer projects and efforts over the next year to get the word out, to get signatures collected, and to get this on the ballot. So sign up, join our Discord if you want to be really involved. We always love seeing people come hang out with us on Discord and work on projects. So yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Logan. This has been a really great conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So that's that. Thank you guys for watching. I realized that this episode was kind of about a niche topic of conversation, but I enjoyed digging into it. And I gotta say, I walked away from this conversation feeling pretty open to the idea of approval voting. Personally, I would support any measures for approval voting or ranked choice voting or even star voting were the opportunity to arise in my community. And for those of you who are Andrew Yang supporters like myself, it might interest you to hear that Andrew Yang actually tweeted out in support of approval voting in the time since this interview was recorded. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching to the end. Hit the subscribe button because I got more guests coming soon. Peace.